Fantastic. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this LSE public event. It's a great honour for me, Paul Dolan from the LSE, to be having a discussion with Lord Gus O'Donnell, previously the head of the Home Civil Service and the Cabinet Secretary for a very long time, I think, Gus, wasn't it? Or at least it felt like a long time. And now chair of Frontier Economics. We're going to have a discussion about why policymakers and the public aren't demanding that happiness is taken more seriously. Both of us have a very keen interest in the use of measures of well-being to inform policy decisions. And we'd like to make this session as interesting and as engaging as we can. So we're going to have a conversation with one another for about 30 minutes or so, and then we're going to open it up to a Q&A for about 45 minutes. When we come to the Q&A, you can upvote the question. So if there's a really especially hard one that you want Gus to answer, I'll obviously take the easy ones. Gus can take the hard ones. Then vote them up, and they'll be to the top of the list. And what we also want to do is we want to engage you in some polling to get a sense of, because it's really hard when you're doing these Zoom sessions. I'm very much a big fan of doing live events, and it's very hard when you can't see the audience. So what we'd like to do is to get you involved in this to some large degree, and we're going to have some questions that we're going to ask you. Very simply, just say whether you agree or disagree with the policy. I know that's very, very, very simple and crude, but that's how we can do this on Zoom. So it will help frame our conversation for the first half an hour or so. And we're going to do a couple of questions that are about general policy issues, about why policymakers and the public aren't asking that we take happiness more seriously in appraisals and interventions. And then we're going to have a couple of questions on COVID. We thought we'd split this roughly half of the time, although it's not going to work out exactly like that, roughly half the time on general policy questions and half the time on issues relating to COVID. So I'm going to actually just get us kicking off, Gus, if that's all right, and we'll take the first question, see what the audience makes of this. Have your fingers on the buttons, please. Oh, look, there we go. The first poll is up. The first question. Can you, just vote basically. We're going to keep this poll open for what? Should we go to 30 seconds? Let's have 30 seconds for this first poll and see if we have any disagreement with the policy that there should be immediate access to mental health services, e.g. for eating disorders. And we will stop the poll now. So, okay, Gus, this is actually a really good place to start. So this is a question that says that we should have immediate access to mental health services for a range of conditions, and the example here is an eating disorder. We have essentially 97% of those polled, about 136 people, saying that the answer to that question is yes, and they agree with the policy. So the obvious question that I have for you as a starting point is, that's what we want overwhelmingly. Why the hell is it that policymakers aren't doing it?
Well, that's a very good question. It's the first thing to say. Pretty overwhelming result. I think number of reasons. First of all, for a long time, there's been stigma about talking about mental health, so it's never had the attention that it deserves. Secondly, it is not as visible. Someone goes into a hospital with a broken leg, it's fairly straightforward. You go in with mental health disorder, it's less obvious. Thirdly, I'd say medical hierarchies. Is it, do you see all those programs about, emergencies and, consultants, and they're all doing fancy operations and all the rest of it? But I think the profession that deals with the mental health issues is relatively undervalued. I mean, Richard Lauer has done a lot of work on this, and which is why you and I are so passionate about mental health issues, because it's absolutely clear that those people who are at the bottom of the well-being ladder, we know the data, mental health is a massive part of it. And we have so many people who have got diagnosed mental health diseases that don't get treatment. But I think what's the reason, I think, is that we've never ring-fenced the mental health budget, right? We've said, number of secretaries of state, I'll give you the quotes, we give parity to mental and physical health. It hasn't happened, right? And until we identify those things, it won't happen. And until we start saying, actually, curiously enough, the returns from dealing with mental health are much higher than they are from a lot of these physical health conditions, and we translate that through the medical hierarchies, I don't think we're going to change the situation.
So, yeah, it's interesting you said about giving parity to mental health and physical health. So they say that. So they are alert to the fact that the public may be demanding that to a greater degree now. But you think there's barriers in the professions that stop?
Yeah, the reality is it's not happening. I mean, there aren't the trained personnel that you need. Excuse me. You look at provision in schools, it's minimal. Those that do it are doing a brilliant job, but there's not enough. And the rest of it, I think, we're all talking about, trying to get people to open up to mental illnesses, to depression. I mean, during this period of COVID, for God's sake, we know that loneliness, we know that mental health conditions will have gone up dramatically. For those with existing mental health issues, it must be even more. Where have you seen anyone talking about mental health issues, on those press conferences? We're obsessed with COVID deaths, with admissions to hospital.
Let's come to COVID, because I think I want to try and keep, insofar as we can, because I think you're right that magnifies some of these issues. I wonder whether people, what you say about stigma, it's also, I think, potentially that insofar as the public aren't asking for the same degree of priority to mental health problems as physical ones, is that they kind of imagine their abilities to cope with mental health problems to be easier than they actually are in fact. I remember when I did my early work on QALYs that people imagined having physical functioning problems to be as bad as having mental health problems. And, we know in fact that that's not true in the experience of the conditions, that there's much quicker and more rapid adaptation to physical functioning problems than there is to mental health problems. And so maybe there's still a sense in which, well, you can kind of get over it, can't you? You can sort of pull yourself together or something. Okay.
Exactly. I think it's that public thing. It's your fault, right? You're not, you haven't got control of yourself, pull yourself together, all those sorts of things, which are amazingly unhelpful to someone who's got depression. So I'm just hoping that this period where people are caring more about each other's well-being and worrying about these things might lead to a long-term structural benefit where we actually think, there are plenty of mental health issues that we should be talking about all the time. I suspect another reason is that there are worries, when someone goes in with a broken leg, you put them in plaster and they'll recover. With mental health, the recovery rates from all sorts of things are not as obvious and are more problematic, I think. But that's, we don't give up with cancers or dementia because we don't have a perfect cure for it. But somehow we translate this into mental health as, oh well, we can't solve these problems, so let's not even try.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. You mentioned Richard Layard earlier, and it's interesting when he was making the case for mental health therapists, the training of CBT therapists in particular, that the case was made much stronger when the economic argument was presented, right? So this ends up saving more money than it costs, and it's kind of, I don't know, it's just an observation that actually that still seems to be quite prominent. If you can make the economic case for the interventions, then they're more likely to be supported.
I think that's right, because the argument to spend more and more on health is always there. There's always someone, you don't get to a point where you say, well, okay, that's enough. There's no need to spend any more. It's kind of unlimited, the demand, I think. And really, it's all about prioritization. And I think that's where the issue comes in. We can argue all day about whether the health budget should be bigger or smaller. But actually, when you think about where the money goes, the truth is an enormous amount is spent still in those last few months of life, when if you were doing a QALYs calculation or a well-being years or whatever, you would reallocate away towards particularly mental health issues, particularly for younger people.
I think also, I was just going to move on to the next question in a second, but I think it's important also to see that this isn't just a public policy concern. It's not even a health budget concern. That mental health is a challenge for people in work, for employers, for employees. Maybe we need to kind of broaden out the responsibilities, I guess, for dealing with mental health issues, and it's not just rooted through the health budget in the public sector.
Totally. And I mean, I think it's so true of so many health issues. There's Nigel Crisp, who was the chief exec of NHS during my time, has written a book called Health is Made at Home, Hospital is for Repairs. Not the snappiest title, okay?
No,
you do better on titles, I'm sure. But the point is, I think, brilliant in that, what we need to do is spend an enormously amount more of our public spending on prevention, not cure. And preventing people having problems is so much more important. And if schools could be keeping an eye on mental health of kids and thinking about what are the things that are disturbing their mental health and potential problems, then we might kind of save a lot of money further down the road, because mental health problems can lead to problems getting jobs, lead you into crime. And actually a lot of the work that Richard did shows that when you put that combination of physical and mental health things together, they are much more expensive to deal with and much more difficult to deal with than one or other on their own.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Let's move on to the next question, because I'm not going to preempt what the answers will be. Let's get the poll up. Can we get our second general policy question up, please? So again, please do vote. This is made much more enriched by knowing what you think. So we should need to move away from the myth of social mobility towards social justice. And let's again see where the audience is going to be on this. We'll go to 30 seconds again. That seems to be quite a good time at which to close the poll. Got a little bit more disagreement on this one. Polls closed, please. Thank you. So okay, we've got about 4/5 of people agreeing with that policy and about 1/5 of people disagreeing. I might take the liberty of introducing a bit of the context to this question, if I might, Gus, and then I'll allow you to chip in. So when we think of, I'll just give a couple of challenges to the social mobility narrative. The first of which, I guess, is that really we're not actually talking about social mobility at all. Actually, we're talking about occupational mobility. We're talking about people moving into what we consider to be higher status, often better paying jobs, and away from those that are deemed to be low status. We even call them low skilled jobs. And that then creates an expectation that unless you do achieve the higher occupation, the higher status, the higher paying job, then you're somehow a failure. And that creates this narrative that, that you can, if you work harder, you can become successful. And more importantly, if you don't become successful, then that's the result of your lack of effort or talent, that it makes it an individual responsibility issue. And the facts are, in society, of course, we will always need those jobs that are deemed to be low status. We've seen that. I'm trying not to get too much into the COVID discussion, but we've seen that writ large with a lot of the key workers throughout the pandemic. They haven't been the jobs that would typically be associated with high status and high pay. And so I wonder, so the sort of context of this question is the idea that we've become obsessed with getting a handful of working class people to become middle class and to become successful. We can pat ourselves on the back and say we've done a really good job, when actually there's something quite systemically wrong with that narrative.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was surprised by the answers to that question, that you got so many saying yes to it.
Well, they've all read Happy Ever After. That's why.
I know they're kind of, you've brainwashed them already, Paul. But I have to say, this is something where we'll come to things we disagree on. But I'm very much with you on this, and I've spent a lot of my time. There are very many worthy people and worthy charities and all this, all going for social mobility. This is brilliant, and it turns out it's like, please, can you all be like me? And the reason I was the youngest child of 5. went to state schools, went to Warwick University and then Oxford. But the interesting thing about the universities and the kind of, when I was at Oxford, it was absolutely clear their idea of success. There was only one idea of success, and you'll understand this, Paul, because they're all academics. The only successful thing to be was to be an academic, right? And the idea you might go and work in the civil service was complete failure, because, you know, failures did that. So as a result, I ended up going off to be an academic for a while, and then realised that, you know, there's more to life
Saw the
than
light very
being
quickly.
an
Got
academic. You know, you can actually influence things more from other places. So I've kind of always been somewhat jaundiced by the social mobility, that it's about, you know, I want more people to be like me. I kind of take the view that, isn't it brilliant that people have different aspirations and want to do different things in different ways? And there's millions of paths to fulfillment. And what I regard as success is people having lives that they personally believe are satisfying and worthwhile. And I'd like to say are pro-social. So
do you think that it's got worse, in a sense, that we've, over the last, you know, few decades, of course we haven't got very much good data on this, of course, so we're speculating and looking at looking at the world through our own lenses, but do you think this idea of success and failure and the narrowness within which we define it has become worse or better as time has moved on?
Well, if you think of what are the big changes, you know, big changes in the percentage of people going to universities, you know, increased dramatically. And I think that rhetoric of here's what you do if you're successful, and it starts, to my mind, and this is a problem I think with the education system, of to be successful, you've got to pass exams. You know, in the old days, it used to be 11 plus, GCSEs, A levels, so you can get to university. And actually then, curiously enough, quite often the rhetoric about exams goes away, and it's like, you go to university because you'll get a nice job thereafter. And yeah, better if you get a good degree. But I mean, your lot, Paul, have just basically completely got rid of that, because as far as I can see, everybody gets a first or a 2-1. And so there's no real differentiator. You've decided not to bother with classifying in different ways. So,
what do you mean, your lot? What's your lot? What are you talking about?
well, academics, you know, I mean, you know, who else do I blame for the fact that the numbers are so dramatic? I mean, to be honest, I don't really care about them. And I'm really pleased there's some wonderful LSE research that basically shows not much relationship between degree results. And, you know, and I'm also of the view that since most of these universities are asking for all A's or A stars, they're not a differentiator either. I mean, I'd love universities. We could change this social mobility thing if we actually said, let's take people in. Let's not bother about using A levels, because I've never seen the evidence that A levels are a good indicator of future success. I mean, you know, there are all sorts of causation problems.
I think is it Addison Wolf, or maybe it is, who talks about universities being signalling. I mean, that's really what the degrees. I mean, they're to signal something about your intelligence and capabilities. They're not to actually equip you with any of the skills that might be required on particular vocations and occupations.
But how are we getting the signals to decide which people go in? By a set of exams.
Well, I agree with you. I mean, I agree with you that, I mean, we've moved the 11 plus up to 18. That's really what we've done, is to say that you go to university and you're a success, and if you don't, you're a failure. And as I think, again, we want to try and come on to things that we might disagree on, but we are definitely very much aligned on the affording more status to vocational training, to further education that's not necessarily in a higher education institution. But of course, I have to. I mean, I have to be careful, because I am at the LSE, and this is going to go out as an LSE podcast. So, LSE has done. LSE has done. Actually, this is in fact true. LSE has done better than any other Russell Group university at widening participation, at getting kids from working class backgrounds into higher education, and should be commended for that. The important thing then, of course, is, as I think you allude to, is that you don't have to then fit in to a particular narrative about how you should live your life or the kinds of jobs that you should go on to. And I think all universities can do much more to take diversity, proper diversity, into account as we teach our students.
Exactly. And think about, you know, what kinds of jobs will actually result in you having a worthwhile life. You know, I think one of the things, I did this thing on wellbeing way back, and the chart that David Halpern from the Behavioural Institute, Behavioural Insight team came up with, which was really good, was relating income and job satisfaction, as it were, you know, well-being in a job, how you felt. And that struck me as all of my time in all the careers advisory services I went through. They were always telling me about, you know, how much you earned in these various things, not whether people actually thought their jobs were worthwhile or not. And, you know, I did feel for that, because it was always hard to get people to choose careers in public service, because, you know, curiously enough, the investment bankers were paid 5 times as much. But believe me, I've had, you know, if I had, as I was tempted to do at one point, go and join Rothschilds or Goldman's, I would have had a lot more money, but I would have been a lot less happy, a lot lower well-being. I mean, in every respect. So, you know, good luck to the investment bankers. You'll be very rich, but you know, there are so
they're
much
the ones.
better
They're
things
the
to
ones.
do
They're
in
the
your
ones
life,
now
and
leaving
you've
off
only
this
got
call,
one.
dropping off the participant list. So let's move on to a couple of questions about COVID, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So can we get our next poll up, please, which is a COVID related question. So again, we'll stay open for 30 seconds. It'd be really interesting again to see what the split across this question is. So require that all policies at a minimum are subject to appraisal of expected life years saved. This is now super interesting. We've now got literally looking like something very close to a 50-50 split. Brilliant, thank you. Can you close the poll? I mean, that's 52-48. What does that remind you of? What vote would that would that vote? What would
society.
that be? In 2016. So of course you know, it's not possible with the Zoom technologies for us to explore further why people disagree with that. So we won't know what they would have in mind when they're disagreeing it. But we got a 50-50 basically on that. I guess the question would be, well, let me ask you that question, Gus. Should we require that all policies, this is at a minimum, are subject to appraisal of expected life years saved?
I was intrigued, by that number. I mean, I wonder what the appraisal of expected life years saved by leaving the EU would have been. Tricky to calculate.
Well, that depends whether we can get the vaccine out of Belgium or not, doesn't
it? So basically, you know, you do try in government to get all policies subject to as good a cost-benefit analysis as you can. And in some places, in some parts of government, that's easier than others. In the Treasury, it's pretty straightforward. In places like Department of Transport, if you're doing roads investments or trains, all the rest of it, you'll get a good standard cost-benefit, which would have expected life saved in there. Interestingly, in health, it's much more difficult to get them to kind of do these things. They'll do it in little bits, like NICE, and National Institute of Clinical Excellence, has got its qualies, and that's for new drugs. If you said to them, give me the qualies on building this hospital, that would be very hard for them. Give me the quality, you know, give me the full analysis of why you've chosen to do more doctors. You know, often politicians come up with what we need is more hospitals or more doctors, you know, very input related. They won't have thought about the ultimate outcomes. And so,
well, I guess in COVID, I mean, but having said that, of course, in COVID, they have been concerned about the outcomes, which is the number of deaths. I mean, that's clearly an outcome.
No, they'd be concerned with very specific outcomes, and I can explain the politics of that. Is fundamentally, it's been about, let's not see the health service overrun. We do not want pictures of people on trolleys not being able to get into intensive care units. That is the political death. So that's been given almost 100% weight, and the rest, actually, I would love to say the West has been discounted somewhat, but actually we now know from the economic impact statements that have been put out, they were never calculated, right? Nobody did those sums.
Right.
So they weren't actually on saying, you know, well, if we close schools, we're going to have these impacts on various things, and we're going to, you know, lockdown measures are going to have these effects, and COVID is going to mean that we're going to lose lives in non-COVID areas because we transferred resources across to COVID. So I wish I could say there was a careful calculation, but it's quite apparent that they didn't do it that way. The politics dominated, and the politics both of for politicians and for medics.
Yeah, no, it's just, I mean, the reason we asked about life years is because would be, in one sense, one of the most basic considerations that you might think of, right? So when you're messaging people to stay at home to protect the NHS and save lives, that there will be unintended consequences of those particular requirements, which means that people who might have a cancer diagnosis would miss it. And actually, we've been doing some work together with an oncologist showing that it doesn't actually take very long, maybe 2 or 3 months, of people missing a diagnosis or, you know, getting treated at a later stage of cancer, for the number of life years lost from cancer alone, just cancer alone, not schools, not anything else, but just from cancer alone, for the number of life years lost to probably exceed those. Of course, we can never know the counterfactual, to probably exceed those that would otherwise have been lost from COVID.
But Paul, let me give you a very current policy problem where it's quite apparent that expected life years saved aren't being used. Vaccination, right? We've all seen the pictures on the telly, and they're all the government are desperate to be showing the 97-year-olds, the 91-year-olds who are having the vaccine first. Now, there's only a limited number of vaccines, so question mark, why 97-year-olds and 80-year-olds not getting it instead, you know?
So I to say a little bit, I mean, so I originally was a health economist back in the day, nearly 3 decades ago now, and I worked with Alan Williams at the University of York, and he...
You're not that old, Paul, come on.
No,
you can't
I
be with that haircut.
Oh, shut up. And he was a great proponent of the fair innings argument, which is the idea that we're entitled to a full life of health that was measured in quality terms, or just even simply life years. And the less of that you have, the more you're cheated. And that's a kind of principle of justice that accounts for the lifetime and not just any one snapshot in time. Of course, that argument has been criticized heavily for being ageist. But there are some isms that are potentially fair. And of course, the thing about ageism as distinct from racism or sexism is that we will all be all of the ages that we are until we die. So if you're giving greater priority to a 40-year-old over an 80-year-old, then that 40-year-old, when they're 80, will get less priority in 40 years' time. And so that's a principle justice of fairness over the lifetime. Now, that seems to me to be a very sensible conception of justice. It's actually not just seems to me to be, it's actually what a lot of the public support when we've done lots of studies of various kinds, including, in fact, some work that we're doing now during the pandemic, where we're observing the same degree of public preference, and particularly in many instances from older people, and sometimes especially from older people. So it seems to be very interesting why we haven't had a discussion of this, at least not necessarily might even do policy in exactly the same way as we've done, but why it is that there hasn't been more discussion of not just who's dying, but when, and more importantly, how prematurely. Why do you think that hasn't had more airtime?
Well, I think that's kind of the success, the triumph of politics over virtually everything else. Politicians really don't want you to have that discussion because it requires them to then be rather more explicit than they'd like to be about trade-offs. And they basically want everybody to have above average incomes. They want everyone to get the vaccine. And so, you know, if you get into this, then you face some really difficult choices where there's winners and losers, as it were. And they like to be claiming that we're all winners. And now that seems to me, that explains the politicians' desire, but why the media never ever question this, never come back and say, well, You know, it's interesting about the vaccines. Surely a different way of doing this would be the most vulnerable. And then you could go on to having, you know, the number of years they would go on for. But just doing it by age cohort seems to me slightly odd, I have to admit.
I just want to move on to the final question. I just want to just kind of be clear about the fair innings principle, because there is a sense that you might prefer to give priority to younger people because they have more going forwards. But the fair innings argument is essentially a retrospective account of justice, right? So it's what you've already had. And of course, the fact is that the older people have already had more than people that are younger, and actually much more than many of the young people can ever hope to expect. Good. Let's move on to our final question. I'm conscious of time. We're going to move on to the Q&A very shortly. Let me ask you. This is again a question relating to COVID, and it's sort of prompted by the fact that I think pretty much most governments, it's clearly not just the UK government, has focused on national lockdowns or local lockdowns that affect entire populations, as distinct from, okay, we closed the poll, thank you. Oh, this is brilliant. Again, this is even closer, 50-50 split.
Wow.
Rather than taking seriously the prospect of shielding policies, essentially, where those most at risk from the virus would be treated differently and separately from those least at risk. And those least at risk are predominantly younger people who could continue to go about their daily business, if you like, insofar if it were only possible for us to keep them away from people who were at greater risk from the virus. And that those policies haven't been pursued anywhere, I don't think, have they? Again, we've got a 50-50 split down the middle on this one. Do you want to make some observations or comments on this question and the responses from the polling?
Yeah, I mean, this is intriguing, and I know Andrew Oswald put forward this idea very
he did very early on, yeah.
And you know, I remember talking to him about it. Again, it was quite apparent to me this would be very, very hard. And I said this to him at the time, to get politicians to go with this. They really don't like making these age divides. And question mark, is that to do with the voting propensities? You know, we know that older people are much more likely to vote. If you ever try and take away any of their benefits, I know this because I've been in that position with TV licenses for over 75s, free TV licenses for over 75s, and advising on that. You
do not want to say something about the winter fuel allowance? I know how much you how much you love that. Do you want
to? We just have these policies that take away from the poor and give to the rich, and it's kind of like, really, you know, kind of reverse Robin Hood. Do we really want to give winter fuel allowances to millionaires who've retired to live in Italy? I mean, you know, it just gets me going, I'm afraid. Yeah,
it does every time, I know.
Every time you've wind me up successfully on that. And of course, once you put any of these policies in place, you know, as we know, loss aversion means that taking them away is incredibly hard. In London, they've taken away the right of certain older people to travel free during the rush hour. You know, why did they have it in the first place? But that'll be controversial, and they're already campaigning to bring it all back. So I think that the issue really with this is the view that you can't trust the younger people to actually behave responsibly and keep away from, because they may well, you know, if they're all going back to work, a lot of them may well get the disease. They may well be asymptomatic, so they won't know they've got it. In the absence of a good testing.
But to get this when evidence might not come in. So, you know, you mentioned Andrew Oswald, and I think hasn't he shown recently that is it 92% of people, of workers under 40 don't live in don't have anyone in their household over 65?
Yeah, and you'll see the misuse of statistics all over the place from other people about, you know, saying, and they've found ways to partially get some numbers that are not as high as that. But yeah, basically people don't live with, most people don't live with older people. So you know, you have it's relatively easy to keep the two apart if there's a desire on both sides to do it.
Yeah.
And of course, there are distributional issues that certain particular groups culturally live together more. So you would be, as it were, disadvantaging those groups.
Yeah, I'm going to move on to some general questions in a second that people are coming. I just wanted to make just one quick observation on the policy responses to COVID, is that at a minimum, wouldn't it have been important? You wouldn't have thought it would be sensible to ask older people what they would like to see done.
Yeah.
I don't see there's any sense in which there's been any consideration of what people in their 80s and 90s would actually like the policy responses to COVID to be, and that seems a very odd. An odd thing.
I agree with that, and there's almost this feeling that it's paternalism. You know, we know what's best for them. They'll put themselves at risk, and they'll die, and we'll be blamed. So let's not allow them the freedom to make those choices. And now, to the extent that some people are completely incapable of making those choices, maybe for medical reasons, then you can understand that. But otherwise, I think you're absolutely right. I trust the people is my view a lot of times, and that seems to be a way of getting good compliance in many ways.
Yeah, good, thank you. All right, let's move on. So we've got some questions coming in now. I'm going to they've been kindly put to me in the chat function. So I've got a question about. I need to scroll back up. There's lots of questions coming. So I'm going to start. I've got a question here. It's about New Zealand, their wellbeing budget, Jacinda Ardern's wellbeing budget. The question specifically is, could Gus and Paul comment on it and its viability? You want to say something about the wellbeing budget?
Sure. I love the New Zealand Prime Minister, mainly because she spent some time as a civil servant in the British Cabinet Office. So she's a complete star.
She must be good then.
Brilliantly trained.
Yeah.
Huh?
I said she must be good then.
Yeah, exactly. I didn't actually come across her, unfortunately. But I mean, I think she's a star. Let's get that clear. And I think the wellbeing budget is certainly a step in the right direction. I mean, the problem is the reality of it as to whether they're actually making decisions based on it. And, you know, there are 4 different parts of it. There are all these columns. The reality, if you're in government, is how do you do the trade-offs between them? How do you kind of, some of them are put in terms of capital, some of them are in terms of flows. So it's not an ideal operational setup, to be perfectly honest, but I think that's quibbling. I think the fact that they're having the conversation about well-being, the fact that they talk to people about what really matters to them, the fact that this budget is out there. And I wrote a thing in the Financial Times recently, and I was saying that, you know, countries are now starting to talk about this, and it's news from New Zealand to Iceland, and quite a lot in between was the way I put it. And Scotland's doing it. You know, a lot of other countries are getting there, and they may not do it perfectly, they may not do it quite the way I'd like them to do it, but it is moving the right way, and it's moving us away from this complete obsession with GDP, which, as any good economist knows, is a good measure of activity, one we would like to keep, but it's not a success measure.
Yeah, well, actually, I'll maybe make some comments towards the end, but just we've got another question. This actually kind of segues into something that's also popped up as a question about Mark Carney, you know, talking about the move away from using GDP and financial value towards more human values. Do you have any sense in which this is a turning point, or is this just another example of, you know, someone saying something and no one paying attention?
I spent a couple of hours with Mark yesterday, virtually, of course. We were talking about plans to operationalize the net zero idea and to have people put their money into investments which actually help all sorts of companies move towards net zero and have plans that move into net zero. So I'm a big fan of Mark's, and yeah, the Reith lecture's going on at the minute about value. I would definitely say we are moving that way. The whole bit about the environment, I think, is good. if you look at companies, excuse me, you look at companies, the whole ESG agenda is big, but the S part isn't really being picked up at the minute. The E part is good, that's climate change. The S about social, about the well-being of your customers, the well-being of your staff, that I think is the next big thing that we need to get going. So I think Mark is pushing us in the way of actually dealing with what's quite a tricky well-being issue, because I think some work that's been done by Jan Deneve and Jeff Sachs about when you look at the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, and one of them is about well-being, and if you relate the others to that well-being goal as the ultimate goal, then you find that there are lots of things like the climate change stuff, which would require you to put prices, say, of energy up, that what people think of as damaging their well-being in the short term, but actually create better long-term outcomes. So there are, I think, lots of policies where we'd have to accept the fact that they may well reduce well-being in the short run, but increase it over the long term. So it's about sustainable well-being. I think it's really important.
Yeah, thank you. I've got a question. I'm going to make a comment on this because I've got a question coming in about can we measure quality of life, and that'll give you opportunity to have some water. Can we measure quality of life, not life expectancy? And of course, absolutely yes. But what I was going to say in relation to this is that it's interesting, isn't it, that for economists, if you look at a utility function in a standard economics textbook, it says utility is a function of Y, income. And maybe if they're getting a bit wild and wacky, they might put relative income in. But even an economist appreciates that it's not income that's important for well-being. It's what income allows you to do. And of course, you can, with more money, satisfy more of your preferences. And on the health side, it has been predicated almost entirely on increasing life expectancy. That health is measured only in the mortality risks, really. And we've seen this writ large during COVID. And sort of well-being gets like the important consequences of both having money and life is to be able to enjoy it in some whatever sense. We'd have to call it happiness, well-being, but to live a life that's rich, fulfilling, contains pleasure and purpose in the language that I would use. And that seems to have fallen. Why is it that falls? It sort of comes maybe to the main theme of what we're discussing, that this sort of falls between the cracks. The idea that you would want a life that's high in pleasure and purpose is almost like a luxury good. What you ought to be doing is having as much money as possible, living as long as possible, and any trade-offs that you might make for money and life expectancy are kind of crazy because they're seen as crazy from an economist perspective, or they're seen as crazy from a health care.
Yeah, I think we got a lot of attention on this when life expectancy numbers, which have been going up forever, started to plateau. And I think you get this differential between high income people where life expectancy keeps going up and lower income people where it's coming down. And that's meant that people then go one step back and they look at healthy life expectancy, which is obviously a much better measure, which is how long have you had in good health. And I think that whole business that you've been talking about, qualities and well-being years, gives you the right answers and what we should be concentrating on. I mean, just keeping people alive at a really great expense in not very comfortable circumstances for another few months. I mean, and that's costing huge amounts of money, that clearly, versus being able to spend that money on some preventative policies, which actually give big increases in healthy life expectancy. It's just a no-brainer. And I think we need to kind of really work hard at getting that across, that it is about quality. And I mean, I don't really, this thing about income, which you talk about a lot, Paul, as well. Having left the civil service, I now get paid more than I ever did as a civil servant. And to be honest, it's quite hard to spend a lot of money. I mean, and I don't quite see what you get for it. The things I'd want to buy, I can't buy. I would like to see Manchester United just make the most of the talent they've got, for example. I'd like to see, lots of things happen, which it just money doesn't buy. And I think at the low level, of course, it's massively important and it makes a massive difference. But, for those people who've got the first billion, what does the second billion do for them? I just genuinely don't get it. You cannot consume it. It's not possible.
Yeah, well, the thing is that it becomes addictive, isn't it? It's like any addictive good, and it is true. You know, it is true that, and that you can't emphasize this enough. I don't think that poverty makes people miserable. That, you know, if you're paying attention to how you're going to pay, how you're going to, so it does. I do get a little bit. I feel sometimes a little uneasy when happiness economists talk about money doesn't make people happy. Well, that's easy to say when you've got it. But actually, you know, poverty does make people miserable when you're paying attention to feeding the kids, paying the bills. You know, that does induce considerable degrees of anxiety, and so we should be alleviating poverty. People themselves make sense for them to be motivated to earn more money. The problem is that we don't know when to stop, do we? We kind of become addicted to the narrative, and then we just accumulate. And I don't know if we've got any good suggestions and recommendations about how we kind of get ourselves off that treadmill to move away from what I talk about in Happy Ever After, from more please to just enough. I don't know if you've got any reflections on that.
Yeah, when you talk about people who are seriously rich, so I do happen to know a number of Goldman partners, and their bonuses were pretty obscene in my view. For them, it was a success measure, so it really mattered, right? And if X got a bigger bonus than them, that was really important to them, and it really affected their self-esteem, and it really affected their well-being. So I understand that, but it wasn't the income that did it. So trying to find ways which can solve those problems, which don't necessarily require very large differences in pay. You know, in the civil service, we had one of the most elaborate job appraisal systems I've ever had. And in the end, you might get a box 1 rather than a box 2. And you'd get about 2 and 6 more. You know, you get about £5. It was just, the money was, in relative terms, just completely trivial. But it mattered in terms of standing and esteem. So I think there's that. And the other part, I'm doing this thing with Andy Hallday in this commission on civil society. One of the big differences between us and, say, the United States is how little is given in philanthropy. You know, that rich people, on average in the UK, don't give anything like as much to charity. Now, partly that's some tax reasons, but I kind of wish, and I hope that COVID has generated this understanding that actually volunteering, helping other people, not only helps them, but really gives you a buzz. You know, I mean, the stuff I do for pro bono economics makes me feel really good. I don't know if it does any good to anybody else, but I mean, I like it, and it improves my well-being. So, you know, why aren't they doing more?
I'm glad you mentioned that. You know, I've had a lot to say in various places about this, about tapping into the selfishness of selflessness that actually you do. And there's very good, you know, RCTs and good evidence, causal evidence, showing that in the case of volunteering, for example, when you draw attention to the personal benefits that come from it, you get more of it and people do it for longer. We've kind of created this narrative about, you know, sort of pro-sociality almost has to be self-flagellating. We kind of create this hierarchy of intentions and motivations, which I think distracts us from doing the most good. We make it transparent, we make it visible, we celebrate it, and we get more of it.
And I think, to be honest, we need to kind of find ways to generate a society in which people can do things which, you know, now I've got to do something terrible. I've got to do some voluntary work or community sport or whatever.
Yeah.
But we do things that people really, really enjoy. And, you know, that's, I think, where we're failing. We're not creating really enjoyable opportunities for people to actually do things which actually make the world a better place, you know. So how do we do that? That's a really interesting question. I think in the charitable sphere, a lot of it used to be, you know, when I remember in the civil service, they said to me, go do some volunteering. And I did some volunteering playing football with some new migrants and some people who have various issues. I really enjoyed it. I don't know if they cared one way or the other, but it did strike me that it fulfilled part of what one should do, i.e. there was enjoyment in it. The other part, though, that it wasn't a very efficient way of doing it. So I mean, that was what led to pro bono economics. We thought, well, if you're economists, actually you really enjoy doing economics, and presumably you really understand about marginal utility and really understand about helping people who are very poorly off. So getting economists to come and volunteer to help charities establish their impact and be more effective, you know, what a brilliant win-win. You can then
that my line?
coming out the canal or painting a room, you're using your skills, and I think that's where we need to think about it.
Okay, let's ask. I've got a question that has come to the top of the list. It seems around sexism in policy. So basically, on whether we believe a disregard of mental health and happiness intersects with sexism in any way. For example, depression, anxiety, eating disorders have higher incidence amongst women, and begs the question whether there are underlying biases in that regard.
Oh, good question. I mean,
And I thought I'd give you the tough one.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, you said you would, and you have kept your word. If you look at our politics, you know, it isn't gender neutral. You know, we are dominated by. If you look at the cabinet, dominated by men. There are all sorts of issues. Civil service try very hard. Civil service is actually more female than male, but as you go up the ranks, that diminishes, although the senior civil service is getting there, I'm pleased to say. So I'm sure there's some sexism. I'm sure following that lovely book about invisible women, there's lots of biases that are in there, either consciously or unconsciously. So it wouldn't surprise me. And when you look at the COVID effects, you know, there is a massive gender imbalance in what's been done in terms of lockdown measures and the impact they've had on women rather than men. So there's a gender imbalance. It's hurt the poor more, it's hurt women more, and it's hurt young more, the lockdown measures. And, you know, I do genuinely think we need to work very hard at this. I was speaking to this morning, God, I'm name dropping today, Julie Gillard, the former Australian Prime Minister, and she's working hard on this to try and think about how you get rid of some of these biases in all sorts of different aspects of life, but particularly in governments. But it's undoubtedly true at the minute. I think that we underplay the gender aspects of policies, and as a result, we don't. You know, there is implicit sexism in there, definitely.
Yeah, I think you mentioned The Invisible Women by Caroline Credo Perez. I would recommend that book to everybody. It's a really compelling read about how we've had a blind spot to women in public policy. Yeah. I mean, overlaid with that, of course, because many of these things are related to intersectionality, is the issue of class and poverty. You mentioned that significantly. And again, you know, the people making the decisions in relation to COVID or anything else come from a particular population subgroup. And we talk about diversity. It's we talked about age earlier. We should certainly have more diversity of age. It'd be really interesting to see if policy in COVID had been made by 80-year-olds rather than mostly men in their 50s. So there's a whole range of other characteristics, I think, that are important when we're considering policy making and the impacts of those policies on populations. I'm going to look at a question about work now. I've got a question that's come in, which is about considering the amount of time we all spend at work, how can the private sector be encouraged to take a better lead in looking after the well-being of employees?
Right. Well, I mean, this is a massive thing because we know A, we spend a lot of time at work, and B, work is really important to us in terms of well-being. You know, not having a job is, you know, up there as one of the biggest problems for your well-being. And then having a bad job where you don't feel in control, all those sorts of things. And these are all adjusting, you know, allowing for income and all the other factors. You still get these effects coming through. So good work is massively important. And also, we actually know, and this is where I can pass it back to the economist maybe, in Paul, that people who have higher well-being have higher productivity. I mean, there's causation issues there, but I think some great work by Anne Deneve looking at call centers, has shown that there's an independent effect, and that actually, if people are feeling better, they actually are more productive, and the causation goes that way, as well as going the other way. But there's a very strong work that way. So I think work is really important. I think the key to getting this more generally is that movement that started and getting quite big in the US, big in Canada, about businesses thinking about purpose. And it's not just the cold Friedmanite, the job is to maximize profits for shareholders. Actually, businesses have a purpose to have more stakeholders. And so caring about the well-being of their staff is massively important. Now, the question you then have to get for the economist, and this is where I'm going to hand the difficult one back to Paul, is if it's true that people with higher well-being have higher productivity and those companies do better, so how come the market doesn't sort that out? And companies that don't look after their workers that way just aren't profitable and cease to exist. So why doesn't the market sort this, Paul?
You're asking me, okay, good.
Yeah.
Well, I just say a couple of things. I will answer that question. I never avoid a question. The interventions though in the workplace are really interesting, and I think this is for me where the importance of pleasure and purpose becomes even more important. Is that when companies intervene in ways to create fun or pleasure in the workplace, they often backfire because workers quickly see that this is a cynical attempt to increase productivity. But when they're purpose driven, when they're actually making people appreciate, or you appreciate the work that people are doing by, very well timed and sincere and authentic thank yous and appreciation of the efforts that people are putting in, they are much more galvanizing, because no one at work wants to feel like they're wasting their time. And I think that's really significant, is where purpose comes in. But I think it's interesting about the market failures though, because it does, as someone who's sort of morphed more into a psychologist over the last decade or two, the way that economists and psychologists approach work, or how they view work, is actually quite different, isn't it? That an economist sees it as a bad that requires compensation. It's basically a cost. No one wants to be at work, right? So Keynes, Keynes spoke, about how when we were going to get the returns from growth would lead us to work in 2-day weeks, right? We'll be working 2-day weeks now. Because we want leisure time. So work, it doesn't, in that sense, there's no reason why companies should care about well-being, because it's a cost. And so all they need to do is pay you enough to make it worth your while to go in. Psychologists, on the other hand, spend a lot of time thinking about, occupational psychology and work and health and work and how you can make more work more purposeful and meaningful. And so maybe it's the psychologists in general had much less impact on policy than economists have.
That's undoubtedly true, and I think one of the biases in the policy system is that, and I've always described this, coming as an economist myself, that the economists are like Japanese knotweed. We'll go everywhere. We'll kind of look at any policy. We'll give you a cost benefit. We'll do some analysis of it. But you get, psychologists, anthropologists, others, that those skills aren't there, and actually we miss out on that. So I think that's certainly true. Can I put in a word of defense for fun? I mean, I chair Frontier Economics. Our values start with the word fun, because actually if work itself is fun, that's the whole point of it. You don't have to add it on and say, you've done all this terrible stuff. Now you can have your 10 minutes of fun. Actually, you have to say, why are you doing this terrible stuff? Why did we take on this contract? Let's not do that work ever again. Let's do this because it's really uninteresting and it's boring. Let's do the fun bit and the bit that's interesting and uses new techniques and creates new insights and is fun. I mean, I think that's where you have to get to in work. And hopefully things like artificial intelligence, I know they can do this for, I was on the board of PwC for accountants, more and more of the stuff that they're doing in audit will be done in future by artificial intelligence and by programs. And to be honest, it's a lot of the stuff that requires you to go through journals and all that, a lot of the really boring stuff. So I hope that technology can actually add some fun, because a lot of the boring, repetitive stuff is done by machines.
Yeah, so there was a question I've been trying to this is an incredibly difficult challenge in multitasking, which of course we know that the brain is incapable of doing. There was a question that I saw
Wrong
coming
gender,
in,
Paul.
which is, sorry?
You're the wrong gender.
I'm the wrong gender. Yeah, I know. Sadly, the evidence is that women can't multitask any better than men can, which is like neither of us can at all.
All right.
The brain single task very quickly. That's basically what we think happens. But there was a question in relation to AI. I'm not going to. I can't go back the question, but about how the sort of advances in technology are hollowing out occupations and jobs, and we're going to have this very polarized set of professions with elites at the top and poor people at the bottom, and all the middle going to disappear. And I think that's something that Grace Lorden at the LSE I think has been looking at too. I don't want to be misquoting this evidence, but it seems that those middle band of jobs are the ones that are going to disappear with technology. You got any comments on what that means for the wellbeing agenda or for the world generally?
Yeah, there is this amazing bias that when when technology is taking away kind of manual jobs and all the rest of it, we all say, "Oh, that's brilliant!" Yeah, for all those poor people who had those jobs. Now it's kind of coming into middle income. Kind of, my son was working at PwC or whatever, Deloitte's, and their job's going to be taken up. Oh, this is absolutely terrible. Come on, I think we need to be balanced about this. I think the kinds of things that AI is very bad at, and talking to people at Deep Minds and the like, are some of the creative stuff, some of the personal stuff. You are not going to get personal trainers. I mean, yeah, sure, you can have apps and all the rest of it, but there are those things where the essence of the product that's being delivered is the human interaction. And I think you're going to find that there's this growth in demand for personal interaction, for creativity, for things that by their nature computers, at least at the moment, aren't so good at. And so, and away from jobs which are essentially quite repetitive, be they repetitive in a slightly higher skill level. But I personally regard this as very positive, and that it will allow us humans to concentrate on the things which are essentially important to us as humans, and a well-being agenda would very strongly back that up.
Yeah, it reminds me of. So, what are your views on UBI, on universal basic income?
Terrible, absolutely terrible.
Yeah, interesting.
Because basically, I think people really care about work. There's status to work. There's and the idea of work, as you say, it's kind of the economist's idea of work as a cost. I think is again wrong. When I go into work, I interact with, well, in the odd days, I would interact with people personally that I would enjoy interacting with. I'd have conversations I hadn't even thought about. These were all things I liked. These were things that brought me pleasure. The idea of not being able to do this and sit the rest of my life staring at screens fills me with horror, to be perfectly honest. So an UBI that said just stay at home, we'll give you income because all that matters is income, I think wouldn't do it. Again, have to be incredibly careful about if you're out of work and in poverty, income is absolutely massively important.
Yeah, and it does. I mean, it speaks directly to the purpose of people's lives and experiences. It's why unemployment is so scarring. And it stays scarring even when you're back in work, right? Because you've got the fear,
the job insecurity,
of losing your job again. I want to. Maybe we should bring things back. I'd like to move on to maybe where we think things might be going in a post-COVID world. I mean, we had the first vaccines yesterday that we discussed a bit earlier, where we think we're going and how well-being might play into some of that. You mentioned the loneliness issue earlier, whether that's going to manifest itself. I don't want to be misquoting my colleague Liam Delaney, but we've been thinking about how some of those effects will quickly rebound, but others might be a bit stickier. And so having sort of glib overall statements about how the world has got better or worse in some regard is probably a disservice to how things will pan out. Of course, there's going to be a lot of heterogeneity across people, and over time. I wonder if you've got any reflections on
Sure.
any of what I've just said as a stream of consciousness.
Well, it's been a mass experiment where we've required people to change their behavior incredibly radically. I mean, if I look back on this and I think, someone had put to me, well, we're going to have to close pubs on a Sunday. I would have said, well, people are right. You can't do that. To close pubs forever, as it were, and to close all shops. I mean, these are amazing things we've done. And as a result, people have had very, very different experiences. And I think as a result of that, they'll have learned things that they really love and things they really hate. And I expect that some of those will last. For example, I think a lot of people have realized that they really, really dislike commuting. And the idea of getting back on the Northern Line and squeezing in to the train at, 7:30, I mean, fills me with complete dread. I'm not going to do that. I have made up my mind. That's just never going to happen. So I think there'll be a lot of people who say, you know what, I think I can manage my work experience in different ways. Yes, I want to go to the office, but actually I feel better now about a more flexible time. So it might be 3 days a week rather than 5. Not commuting is going to be nice. I like that idea. I like the idea of spending more time with my family. I like the idea of being there at bath time, at, reading to my kids at night. There'll be all sorts of things that I think people have realized that they just drifted into this mode of working. And I think on the other side, employers will begin to realize, actually, we thought if they all work from home, they wouldn't do anything. They watch telly all day, and they don't. And so I think there's been learning both ways. And we've also learned things like things that really matter to us may not be things that relate associated with income, that, hugs, being able to meet people, those kinds of things which don't show up in GDP anywhere are massively important. And social interactions, relationships, these things, hugely important. And I think we'll learn and hopefully come out of this massive experiment with some changes in values, which might be permanent. And I suspect that, I absolutely don't believe in the end of the office. I think that's completely rubbish. I think that you will get a move where there is more flexibility about when people are in offices. And when they do go into offices, I think they'll use the time much more to do the things that you can only do in offices, which is personal interaction, creativity, sessions where you want to bounce ideas off.
Yeah.
And the things that we know you do on Zoom, like the board meetings I've had and stuff like that, be very transactional, and that, which is fine, but it's not easy to get, that personal creativity, all of those gains from being in the same place when you're just staring at a picture, no matter how beautiful that picture is, Paul.
Yes, well, I mean, I tend to, I don't know, that's a very optimistic vision generally. I think I'm probably more optimistic than I am pessimistic about most things in life, but I do have moments where I worry considerably about the long-term damage that's been done, particularly to young people through our policy responses. And particularly in schools, I mean, the closing of schools and those tens of thousands of children that have gone missing that will never return, whose lives are not going to turn out very well, and how there didn't appear to be a recognition of that in the early stages of the pandemic, and it took a long time for people to catch up about the importance of that. I'd like to think that as we move forward and plan for future crises, whether they be economic, financial, or social, or health, that we are better prepared to fully consider the impacts that we're having across the populations.
Yes, I agree. And I think the whole frameworks for analysing these things was terrible. I don't think they made the decision on schools with anyone saying to them, do you realise what the long-term consequences of this would be? I am, on the other hand, so I am more of an optimist than you, Paul, it turns out.
Wow, is that, wow, okay, good. Glad you think that.
I'd be interested to know the adaptation. So the people that fell behind a bit, so they possibly didn't cover the Tudors in their history course in the same way they might have done. Is that really going to make a huge, big difference?
I agree with you about that, but I'm talking about the kids where school is the place that they get comfort, security, care, and food.
Yeah.
Not the ones that have missed out a little bit on their education, and that doesn't really matter so
No.
much in any substantive sense. I'm talking about the ones that are really, where home is not a safe. When it said stay at home, that message
Yes.
for many of us would be a nice warm place with central heating.
Yeah.
For lots of people, that isn't the case. But I don't want to end on a too negative. Let's go to education. The final question, and then we're going to have to wrap up in a couple of minutes. This is about whether we should be, and to what degree we should be, educating people about well-being in schools.
Totally. I mean, I would go further than that. I would actually say, let's not spend quite so much time examining kids, and let's basically, find out more about their well-being. Our well-being scores, they do this. PISA does it. For kids are abysmal. We are so far down the international league tables on this. It's just untrue, and it really shocked me. So yeah, we need to spend more time, I think, on looking after their well-being, and have as the goal of schools that they should improve the well-being of their kids. And it turns out if kids with high well-being get better at exams and have more satisfying lives later. So this to me is the fundamental, and it's what it should be about. And as a parent and as a teacher, that's what I want to be doing, as opposed to what percentage did you get that got A's to C grades at GCSEs. There's more to life than that.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, what a fantastic place to finish. There's more to life than that. I hope that people have enjoyed this session. I know I have. The time has flown very quickly. I think I'm getting that we're all going to start disappearing in a second. Thank you very, very much, Gus. That was an absolute pleasure and purpose. And thank you, everybody, for your questions and for polling. I think the podcast of this event will be available sometime shortly thereafter. And thank you all again very much.